Through the dimly lit corridor, Maine stood before the sacred shrine. Pope Oberlin, now aware of Heather's message, fell into a lengthy silence, exhaling a deep sigh. He had seen Heather growing up. Oberlin inquired about Garcia and the kingdom of Wolfheart, as well as the new poison. Maine responded, stating that it had proven remarkably effective in conquering Fong-Tooth Fortress. The defending forces held out for a month before perishing, and the Judgment Army swiftly breached the city walls. The residential areas were devoid of life, but when it came to the assault on Wolfheart City, the poison seemed to have lost its effect. Presently, the enemy's resistance remained stubbornly resilient. Oberlin quickly identified two mistakes made by Maine. Firstly, he should have launched the attack during the initial peak of the plague, seizing the opportunity to swiftly treat the afflicted residents with medication, thus significantly reducing their animosity and gain more church followers. Attacking a month later might have minimized casualties, but it also provided the enemy with ample time to react and discover a way to counteract the spread of the plague. Secondly, Maine should not have been overly concerned about the losses suffered by the Judgment Army and the God Punishment Army. Maine lowered his head in deep sorrow. Oberlin gently tapped his shoulder with his scepter and then offered him some words of comfort. He informed Maine that Garcia and the king of the Wolfheart Kingdom had gathered in one place, presenting an opportunity for the church. It was a chance to capture them all at once. Oberlin stood up and motioned for Maine to follow him. Guided by the guards, Maine walked alongside the Pope, slowly making their way deeper into the dungeon. The enormous stone of God Punishment emitted a faint glow, illuminating the path beneath their feet. The guards ignited their torches, casting flickering light, revealing several towering iron frames standing alongside the stone pathway. Among the dusty air, a canvas covered in dust came into view. It rose high, clearly concealing a colossal object beneath it. Originally meant to be revealed in the final 2 years, the ultimate weapon now needed to be activated ahead of schedule. Maine could hardly believe his eyes. It was a massive, grotesque four-wheeled iron carriage, with a single wheel taller than his own stature. It lacked a carriage compartment, instead featuring terrifying metal ramming horns and skeletal frames. At the center of the frame, a spiky bone shield was mounted, as large as 3 or 4 door panels combined. 2 straight iron rods, one on each side, protruded from the shield's openings, pointing forward like poised arrows. This weapon could only be activated through the use of magic and required the presence of 3 or 4 witches to operate it properly. The following words from Oberlin nearly caused Maine to stumble and fall to the ground. It originated from the church's enemy, the demons from hell. Oberlin cautioned that this weapon must never be seen by the common folk. To assist him, Oberlin would dispatch 2 pure ones. Oberlin assured Maine that no one could escape from their hands. Pure ones under the Pope's command. Maine's heart trembled. The witches nurtured and raised by the church were known as pure ones, but the witches under the Pope's authority were the selected elite, the strongest among them. Meanwhile in Border Town, Roland held the first high-level meeting of the Border Town in the castle's reception hall. Everyone was actively reporting on their work. Compared to the initial days when the scene was supported by only Barav and his 10 apprentices, the municipal hall had now expanded into a massive group of nearly 100 people. Among them were impoverished nobles, captured knights and their retinues, as well as native residents who had completed their elementary education. The attendees of the first high-level meeting were all the highest-ranking officials of their respective departments. Sonny applied to construct a mill next to the Crimson Water River, and Roland approved the request, instructing Sonny to first submit an application to the municipal hall. Once the funding was granted, they could work with the Department of Construction to develop a detailed plan. Additionally, Sonny also brought a promotion list of serfs, which included a staggering 516 individuals. Next came the Education Department, where Scroll reported that a total of 85 individuals had completed their elementary education. Following that was the Chemical Engineering Department. Kyle's first statement was that he hoped His Highness could find a true representative as soon as possible. He expressed his dislike for being in a leadership position and attending meetings. Roland rolled his eyes secretly. Since becoming a lord, he had learned to selectively ignore certain remarks. Kyle then began his report, mentioning that the laboratory was short-staffed. Fortunately, 5 individuals had recently joined, all of them young but clever, and they had completed their elementary education. The chief alchemist Kyle, in particular, seemed to have a disrespectful attitude and choice of words. However, considering his age and his enthusiasm for chemical experiments, Roland didn't feel much resentment. After all, when Kyle experienced the explosion accident and was completely healed by Manhwa, his first reaction was to conduct experiments without any constraints. He even planned to taste the flavors of different acidic solutions. Such fervent enthusiasm was truly unrivaled. The fourth person to report was Minister Carl from the Department of Construction. He provided an update on the major projects and construction work in Border Town. The next person was Axe, who was attending such a meeting for the first time and appeared somewhat uncertain. He reported that the Second Army had completed its basic training, while the First Army, except for the artillery unit, had been equipped with the latest firearms. Roland expressed his gratitude to everyone for attending the inaugural meeting. He expressed deep satisfaction with the progress and development of each department as presented in the reports. He also mentioned his intention to increase everyone's wage. Furthermore, he announced his plan to officially establish a city in this location after the end of this year's Month of the Demons. In other words, the small town would be upgraded to a true city. This grand city would stretch from the savage wilderness in the west to the Changji stronghold in the east and from the sea in the south. Its natural defenses would be formed by the surrounding mountains and treacherous terrain. The city's area would far surpass that of the capital and any other city in the 4 major kingdoms. He urged everyone to push forward with their tasks and work diligently in order to welcome the establishment of the new city with even greater enthusiasm. He looked at each person in the meeting and said, word by word, "I hope that this city will remain warm as spring, even amidst the boundless winter." After the meeting, Roland asked Barav to stay behind for a private discussion. Barav expressed his concerns about the recent increase in expenses and the significant decrease in the treasury reserves of the city hall. There were only 2,000 gold left, which posed a serious risk. Roland took a sip of tea before responding, stating that next month when the Margaret Merchant Group arrived in the town, they could generate some income through trade. Additionally, once the sale of the hot air balloons was finalized, a substantial amount of income could be expected. Regarding the Department of Chemical Engineering, Barav expressed his dissatisfaction with Kyle's attitude toward Roland. However, Roland reassured him that it didn't bother him. He didn't need scientists to put on a show in front of him, he only expected them to shine and demonstrate their passion in their respective fields. After finishing his experiments for the day, Kyle returned home and took out a book, flipping directly to the last page. It was a neatly divided grid with around 100 squares. Each square in the top left corner had a small number, ranging from 1 to 118. Most of the squares were blank, except for a few in the middle that had symbols filled in. For example, square number 26 had the symbol for iron, and square number 29 had the symbol for copper. Kyle scratched his head, and wondered how could the prince forget such important information. The Highness reassured him that these symbols followed a specific pattern and believed that Kyle could fill in the remaining squares on his own. Prince Roland mentioned that this principle can be found in intermediate chemistry. In order to uncover the truth of the world, Kyle must obtain this sacred text as soon as possible. He suddenly realized that he could bring in the apprentices from the workshop from another city, thus filling all 3 laboratories and having more people assist him in researching methods for large-scale acid production. The following day, as they ventured deeper into the mine, the cave became increasingly damp. Sylvie carefully avoided the water droplets dripping from above as she carried a torch and proceeded through the cave. Even without light, true sight was not hindered by darkness, they only used torches to conserve magical energy. Nightingale, who was leading the way, suddenly stopped at a fork in the path. Lightning took out her notebook and checked their directions. Sylvie used her ability to quickly determine which path led to the mining area and which was a dead end. Once the task was completed, Nightingale circled back to the front of the group, leading them back the way they came. Sylvie noticed that Nightingale's ability seemed to be more than just invisibility. She could faintly sense the magic fluctuations caused by Nightingale's transformations but couldn't capture her form or movements. According to Lightning's description, Nightingale was the most powerful combat-oriented witch in the Witch Union. Perhaps that's why Prince Roland insisted on Nightingale joining the expedition. There are rumors that this mine used to be the lair of an ancient monster. Sylvie wasn't convinced. No creature could escape the detection of her magic eye. The exploration team consisted of 4 members: Sylvie, Nightingale, Lightning, and a young girl named Lucia. Whenever Sylvie discovered an ore, Lucia would transform it into various fragments and carefully store them in her pockets to be identified by the prince. Lightning was responsible for mapping the cave's terrain, and according to her proud remarks, no expedition would be complete without her. Her tone reminded Sylvie of the captain who temporarily stayed on Slumbering Isle. They soon arrived at cave number 23 and encountered 3 more forks in the path. Sylvie hesitated as she noticed there were 5 possible routes, with one seeming to loop back from below. Upon closer inspection, she realized that the narrow passage descended for a short while before turning sharply and heading directly toward the mining area. The group quickly reached the bottom, and Sylvie swiftly scanned the straight forks. The paths were filled with mud and stones, but when her gaze fell on the middle one, just as Sylvie was about to continue exploring along that path, she was hit by a strong wave of dizziness that interrupted her connection with her magic eye. Nightingale prepared to enter and investigate alone. Sylvie closed her eyes and reopened them, only to find herself still surrounded by pitch darkness. It was as if her vision had been stripped away. She suppressed the growing headache and tried to expand her field of view, but there was nothing to be seen. As Nightingale prepared to descend and investigate, Sylvie held her hand and stopped her. She knew there was only one thing that could cause such an effect. Nightingale looked puzzled and asked what it was. "The Stone of God Punishment," Sylvie gritted her teeth and replied, "There is Stone of God Punishment underground, and it's capable of covering the entire area." Upon learning this information, Roland immediately mobilized the soldiers of the First Army to enter the North Slope mine. The final investigation confirmed Sylvie's speculation. The deep cave at the bottom of the mine contained a massive amount of the Stone of God Punishment. Once it was determined that there was no danger, Roland, accompanied by Carter, Anna, Nightingale and Lightning, entered cave number 23. He wanted to witness firsthand of the Stone of God Punishment. The entire cave was illuminated by the light emanating from these crystal-like stones. They rose from the ground, each with a height ranging from 20 to 30 meters, resembling towering neon towers that stood proudly before Roland's eyes. The staircase was not carved out by the soldiers, as Carter explained. He speculated that the staircase had existed for decades, while Anna said it's likely to be here for more than hundreds of years. Roland, accompanied by the knights and witches, walked straight to the edge of the Stone of God Punishment. It was only when standing at the base of the stone pillar that one could truly grasp the enormity of the stones. Roland also noticed that although the stone had the common crystal and prism shape, its surface lacked any crystalline patterns. Instead, it was smooth like a flat glass panel. Lightning was curious about the Stone of God Punishment, while Nightingale was repulsed by it. How she wished that such stones didn't exist in the world. Lightning asked Roland if she could take some as a trophy. Roland nodded, and Lightning swung the stone in her hand, forcefully striking one corner of the prism. However, it remained intact and undamaged. She then took out a dagger, but it couldn't even produce a single fragment. Nightingale tested it with her pistol, causing a few sparks to fly upon hitting the stone. After the smoke cleared, the group approached, only to see that the bullet had left a shallow mark on the surface of the Stone of God Punishment. It was perplexing, as normally applying force would reduce it to powder. Anna, who had remained silent, suddenly spoke up, "Your Highness, do you remember the treasure map drawn by Roland?" Roland pondered for a moment. Anna explained it did not point to the North Slope mine, but rather to this place, this underground cave harboring a vast amount of the Stone of God Punishment. After returning to his office, Roland called for scroll and reproduced Roland's drawing on the Book of Enchantments. The pattern in the book was similar to what he remembered, and the southernmost point did indeed fall at the foot of the North Slope mountain. If Anna's speculation was correct, could this be a map left by the church in their search for new veins of the Stone of God punishment? But why did they abandon everything after going through the effort of carving a direct path to the bottom of the cave with the stone staircase? If the church had established a border chapel 450 years ago, the border town would be completely different today. Judging by the value and uses of the Stone of God punishment, this mine doesn't seem like a resource that can be easily abandoned. Now that the Takira Holy City was an inaccessible forbidden zone, perhaps these answers could only be found by going to the stone tower, or maybe they would never be known. As night fell, Professor Scroll would hold lectures in the hall, unlike the noble academies in the big cities. The students who came to listen were all witches of the Witch Union. When it came to the recent tasks assigned by Prince Roland, Evelyn's eyes dimmed. The prince had yet to give her any real tasks. He would only occasionally ask her to taste his newly concocted baijiu. Evelyn rested her chin on the table, feeling disheartened. And His Highness's baijiu is becoming more and more undrinkable. She once suggested adding water or fruit juice to balance it out, but His Highness seems to only want to make the strongest alcohol. Candle couldn't find the right words to say either, and in this regard, she could sympathize with Evelyn. As she recalls, after arriving at Slumber Isle, most of their time was spent on mundane tasks. With the increasing abundance of fish oil resources, solidified candles became less essential, and drinking alcohol was strictly forbidden by Lady Tilly's orders. Candle recalled the tense early days on Slumber Isle when supplies were allocated based on abilities, which created a subtle sense of division and exclusion among the witches. Fortunately, Lady Tilly took good care of them. However, in the border town, such situations never occurred. The witches all sat at the same table, enjoying meals together with Prince Roland, wearing and using the same things. Most importantly, regardless of their individual powers, they were treated equally. This was evident in their daily interactions. Although Candle had only been in the border town for a short 2 weeks, she had already deeply felt this sense of unity. As the witches settled down one by one, Scroll arrived. Today, there would be no lessons. Instead, a comprehensive test would be conducted to assess their knowledge. It had been 3 months since the witches began their studies, and His Highness deemed it necessary to evaluate their progress. All the questions were written on these sheets of paper, a total of 60. Total of 120 points. She paused for a moment, then added, "By the way, His Highness mentioned that only those who answer more than half of the questions correctly will be able to enjoy the ice cream dessert on Saturday afternoon. Those who score below this threshold will have their afternoon tea privileges revoked." Candle heard a soft click behind her. She turned around to find Nightingale with a bewildered expression, holding a broken charcoal pencil that had fallen to the ground, split into 2 pieces. His Highness made a special announcement that the newly arrived witches from Slumbering Isle had the option to either participate in the test or take a day off. Regardless of their scores, they would be able to enjoy afternoon tea. Candle and Evelyn decided to stay and participate. Honey and Leanne, on the other hand, happily stood up, bowed to Scroll, and left the hall. Sylvie, feeling unwell, also bowed and left after them. The compiled summary sheet was handed to Roland by the Scroll. Lately, he had been puzzled by the new discoveries in the Northern Slope mining area, making it difficult for him to concentrate on his daily work. He decided to shift his focus to something more relaxing for the time being. "Oh, Nightingale actually passed the test?" Roland exclaimed in surprise. Scroll smiled and replied, "Nightingale's score is among the top, and she even got a perfect score in the language section." Roland clicked his tongue and said, "I thought this test would make her cut down on sweets." Before he could finish his sentence, he felt a sharp pinch on his shoulder. This time, all the members of the Witch Union scored above 60, which made him very pleased. Roland noticed that 2 witches from Slumbering Isle also participated in the test. Evelyn scored 5 points, while Candle scored 36. Candle must have had some foundation, and most of her points came from the language section. The individual qualities of the witches are truly astonishing, living up to the continuous enhancement brought by magic, both internally and externally. Witches from the border town are equally remarkable. Within just 3 months, individuals like Lily, Hummingbird, and Rem have gone from being illiterate to mastering the basics of reading and writing. This alone surpasses the abilities of most ordinary people. If everyone could completely set aside their biases and work together with the witches, pushing for social and cultural development, what kind of future would await them? Roland's heart was filled with curiosity. Lucia carefully took out the minerals from her bag, preparing to practice her abilities. Curiosity got the better of Ling, and she peeked her head out from the bed and interrupted Lucia. With a trembling hand, Lucia dropped the bag onto the floor. She turned around and lightly tapped her sister's head, urging her not to disturb and to focus on reading. Pouting, Ling complained that she didn't understand most of the words in the books. Lucia told her that's why she needed to read more, as literacy itself is a process that requires understanding and familiarity. The door creaked open suddenly, and Nightingale walked in. Ling happily ran over upon seeing Nightingale, while Lucia let out a sigh and collected all the metallic debris from the floor into her pouch. She realized that she might not be able to practice this afternoon. A strawberry-scented ice cream was handed to her by Nightingale. Nightingale proudly patted her chest, revealing that it was a reward she specifically requested from the prince. She also handed the ice cream to Ling. When Lucia found out that she only scored 68 points, she felt a bit down. Out of a total of 120 points, she had only answered a little over half correctly. Seeing Lucia's expression, Nightingale comforted her, saying that Lucia had only recently arrived to the border town and her scores already very impressive and that she could always ask her if she didn't understand something. Ling raised both hands and said she wanted to join too, mentioning her desire to work. Nightingale smiled and replied, "The minimum age to start working in the border town is 16 years old and above. Since Ling is only 10 years old, she can't work yet." Ling expressed her aspiration to work in a chemistry laboratory in the future and become a great alchemist. Nightingale shook her head and advised against Ling working in a laboratory, as it was too dangerous. She mentioned that the prince had warned that explosions could happen at any time. Nightingale recounted the incident involving Kyle's accident, which sent shivers down the sisters' spines. Lucia hugged Ling tightly, making up her mind that she would never let her sister work in such a terrifying place. Nightingale suggested that Ling consider working in the city hall. The term civil servant was also coined by the prince. Suddenly, Ling broke free from Lucia's arms and curiously asked, "Sister Nightingale, do you like the prince?" Ling recalled that her mother said if a name is mentioned by a girl many times, it means that person is very important to that girl. Lucia's face stiffened at her sister's question. Goodness, how could she ask such a thing directly? It was incredibly impolite. In a panic, Lucia hurriedly covered Ling's mouth, intended to apologize. However, she was taken aback when Nightingale candidly replied, "Yes, I like the prince." Lucia brought the minerals to meet the prince, still echoing Nightingale's words in her ears. She couldn't help but be amazed by Nightingale's open attitude. It seemed impossible for a witch and a prince to be together. The lord of the border town appeared just as usual, with a slightly sleepy look, indicating that he had recently awakened from a nap. Leaning back in his chair, he seemed relaxed, his tone amiable, completely unlike other nobles who were usually stern. The prince frowned and carefully examined the minerals in his palm, one by one. He didn't recognize these minerals and planned to have Kyle identify them. He instructed Lucia to continue practicing her abilities in the backyard. However, just as Lucia was about to leave, Roland called her back. He praised Lucia for her performance on the test and expressed his hope that Ling would also participate with everyone next time. Lucia excitedly responded and bowed before leaving. As Roland watched the little girl depart with joy, he sighed while looking at the metallic particles on the table. He had been too naive, thinking that he could use Lucia's abilities to uncover the hidden mineral in the northern slope mine. However, reality made him realize the vast gap between mechanical engineering and geology. In terms of color and shape, they were nearly indistinguishable. For example, metals like iron, aluminum, magnesium, and potassium appeared as silver-white metals in their high-purity state, making it extremely difficult to discern them with the naked eye. It seemed he would have to rely on Kyle to solve this problem. Just then, a guard pushed the door open and walked in, carrying a confidential letter from the capital city. Roland set aside his quill and opened the envelope. The letter had no signature, and the handwriting was unfamiliar, but a single sentence indicated that it was undoubtedly from Tassa. It stated that a force of approximately 1,000 people had left the capital today and was heading towards the western frontier. At the Changji Stronghold Theater, as the audience's continuous whistles and applause echoed, the curtain slowly descended. May wiped the sweat off her forehead and looked at Eileen, who was filled with excitement. May nodded slightly in response. As soon as the curtain fell, Eileen couldn't help but rush forward and tightly hugged May. Her acting had received May's approval. May believed that the other young girl's acting was not up to par. Stiff expressions, slow movements, lacking emotions. She pointed out all the mistakes, making the little girl teary-eyed. A backstage crew member chuckled and remarked that May was indeed strict. May shook her head, noting that most of the audience today were commoners. If they were nobles, they would nitpick endlessly. Suddenly, a group of people surrounded them. These people were all actors from the theater, and May recognized the leading woman. Bella sneered, calling May and the group all inept actors from the countryside, continuing to mock and taunt them. Her words prompted laughter from the crowd behind her. Eileen retorted, mentioning the enthusiastic cheers from the audience. Bella, with disdain, mocked, referring the audience as people who deals with mud and shovels every day cannot be called an audience. She then said even if few monkeys get up on the stage to walk around, they would still cheer loudly. If it weren't for the free tickets, no one would have watched their crap show. Bella raised her voice, stating that their theater's income had significantly decreased because of accommodating the group's performances. After all, the nobles refused to attend since nobody wanted to sit on chairs filled with mud and grease stains. Bella's intentions were clear. Her seemingly scolding Eileen and the others were actually directed at May herself. May turned around casually and said, "The decrease in theater income is not solely due to free admission. The theater management has undoubtedly reached an agreement with His Royal Highness and Lord Petrov. The necessary funds will naturally be supplemented by the border town municipal hall. This is a business contract, not child's play." She find it ironic that Bella is a brainless shrew who only knows how to shout and scream. Furthermore, the witch's diary was written by His Royal Highness himself. Does Bella want to imply that His Highness's thoughts are low and vulgar? Insulting the royal aristocracy can result in severe punishment, such as the punishment of losing one's voice. Bella gritted her teeth and said, May went to the border town, not to see Eileen, but for Ferlin. Her voice abruptly stopped as a bright red palm mark appeared on her left cheek. Bella couldn't believe it as she touched her face. May took a deep breath. She had acted on impulse. Two male actors behind Bella stepped forward, condemning May's actions while slowly approaching her. May smirked inwardly. Yes, she had acted impulsively, but she saw no reason to apologize. She glared at the two men. She couldn't help but recall what Carter had once said. While men may possess greater strength, they also have many weaknesses. Certain attacks can instantly render them defenseless. Although she wasn't quite sure how the conversation had led to this, she was prepared to strike if these two men came any closer. Just then, the door to the dressing room was violently pushed open, and a knight in armor walked in. Several armed warriors with spears followed closely behind him. As they entered the room, they aimed their spears at the crowd. May couldn't help but freeze, blinking her eyes, thinking that what she was witnessing was an illusion. However, nothing changed. She even saw a smile sneakily appear on the knight's face. The knight was none other than Carter. The conflict quickly came to an end. Upon seeing the intimidating knight, no one dared to say another word. In the evening, when they returned to May's residence, she poured a glass of wine for Carter. Carter was surprised to see that the home of the most popular actor in the western region was so ordinary. May explained that she had used all her savings to purchase this small, old house located in a deep alley of the inner city. Although the house was small and worn out, moving away from the outer city would at least protect her from harassment and prying eyes of ill intentions. Carter awkwardly apologized, but May smiled and reassured him that it was fine. She poured herself a small glass of wine and asked Carter if he had come to sort out the theater's order and resolve the disputes among the actors. Carter shook his head and replied that it was Timothy causing trouble again, and the main forces were on their way. He had come ahead to make preparations and also really wanted to see May's performance. May froze for a moment, then shook her head. These things shouldn't have been told to her. Carter said he knew where to draw the line, and it wasn't a covert operation either. May promptly took the glass of wine from Carter's hand, saying that he shouldn't drink during mission. However, after everything settles down, she would gladly invite him for a proper drink. As for Carter's previous invitation, she already had an answer in her heart. Some things can only be known after trying. Border town is where she truly wanted to stay. She had decided to move to the border town with her father after the performance is over. Roland arrived at the Changu stronghold 2 days later. Petrovan members of the 5 major families greeted the prince. Roland stated that the exact number and route of Timothy's forces were still unknown, but they were undoubtedly targeting the western frontier. Based on Timothy's usual tactics, they would likely recruit civilians through pillaging and then use drugs to force them into attacking. One of the family members was unclear about the drugs mentioned, so Roland explained that they were evil pills that could grant civilians powers stronger than knights, but once the effect wore off, the users would die in helpless agony. Roland ordered them to bring all their family members and the local civilians into the stronghold. One of the family members mentioned their warehouse with food and goods, but Roland firmly interrupted, saying they had only 3 days to transport as much as they could, but it was essential to gather all the civilians within the stronghold. He cannot allow Timothy and his troops to harm the civilians. After the meeting, the prince summoned Axe into the castle. Roland did not reveal the true information he possessed to the nobles. Thanks to Lightning and Macy's meticulous reconnaissance, the team from the capital city had been exposed. Unlike the previous invaders, they were now sailing on a single-masted ship, following the main channel of the Crimson Water River, heading west into the center of the western region. This was a particularly tricky route. Once the enemy crossed the fork in the river, they could either turn back along the tributary to attack the southern and eastern gates of the Changji stronghold or continue westward, straight to the border town. To avoid the dilemma of dividing forces for defense, Roland had to proactively concentrate his superior forces to defeat the enemy in one decisive blow. Clearly, the fork in the Crimson Water River was the most suitable ambush location. Roland left 100 soldiers to guard the Changji stronghold while he himself would join the front lines after organizing the stronghold's defenses. Nightingale felt uneasy, but Roland reassured her that he had to go. He needed to utilize the abilities of the witches. A white-tailed kite glided through the sky before landing gracefully on Roland's shoulder. Roland summoned the witches and began discussing the creation of bunkers and tanks. The concept of bunkers was already familiar to them, but they had never heard of tanks before. Roland sketched a simple design, explaining that it was a carriage with a cannon mounted on it. However, he mentioned that they couldn't truly call it a tank yet, as they didn't have enough horses. Nevertheless, Honey could gather wild beasts to assist them. Manhwa asked if beasts pulling cannons could be considered tanks, to which Roland replied earnestly, "Of course. They can call them tiger style and leopard style." Next, Roland shared his plan with Lien. He intended to establish defensive lines on both sides of the main river channel. He used sticks to create a rough diagram, but Lien didn't fully understand. While it would allow the soldiers to hide effectively, she doubted it would prevent Timothy's fleet from passing through. Roland didn't offer much explanation, simply stating that there's no way for them to be able to get through. Then he turned to Leaf and tasked her with concealing the fortifications. He instructed her to use weeds and vines, making the bunkers appear more natural and blend in with the surroundings. Leif assured Lien that they should trust the prince. In Roland's mind, he imagined how, once the cannons were pushed into the well-disguised fortifications, each compartment would fire rounds after rounds. The 16 field cannons would maintain their accuracy despite the rough terrain. In fact, at such a close range, they could hit the sailing ships in the middle of the river even with their eyes closed. The enemy would find themselves in a disadvantageous formation. The enemy fleet arrived at the fork in the Crimson Water River half a day later than anticipated. Upon receiving the news, Vaynor gave the preparedness order to the artillery crews and then returned to his own position. Each compartment had a shooting window and a hole near the top of the wall. Climbing 2 steps of the earthen tower allowed for a convenient view of the situation on the river. The soldiers chatted and laughed, happily wiping the cannonballs. Vaynor sighed inwardly. These guys had lost their sense of tension. They no longer trembled like they did on the battlefield several months ago. He couldn't say whether this change was good or bad, as he felt they were underestimating their opponents. However, he couldn't harshly reprimand his subordinates either, because he himself wasn't any better. Since becoming soldiers under the prince, their understanding of combat had undergone a dramatic transformation. Bloody and brutal fighting seemed unrelated to strength, skill, or bravery. They simply repeated the memorized steps from their training, prepare and fire towards the enemy according to training to achieve victory. Alongside the assistance of the witches, they hadn't lost a single battle. One soldier even thought that it would be great if he got injured so he could see the angel Manhwa. Vaynor punched him on the head, telling him to pay attention to the enemy situation. Just as Vaynor was lost in his thoughts, the warning from the scouts brought him back. The soldiers changed their expressions and started loading ammunition seriously, waiting for orders. The compartments became bustling with activity. They had practiced this step too many times. They silently awaited the arrival of the attack signal flag. The fleet, now visible in the distance, was getting closer and closer to their ambush location. However, Prince Roland had still not given any orders. Sylvie and Lien grew increasingly anxious, fearing that they might not have time for the messengers to relay their commands. It was almost too late to stop the fleet from passing through the fork in the Crimson Water River. Roland instructed the 2 witches to listen, and suddenly, a deafening roar reverberated across the river. As if it were a signal to attack, thick smoke mixed with flames erupted from over a dozen bunkers, accompanied by the continuous rumbling of thunderous explosions. Lien redirected her gaze back to the river, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. There were no knights or mercenaries engaged in close combat, yet the deck of the first sailing ship seemed to explode. Wood splinters and body parts scattered in all directions, and the crew on the ship were instantly killed or injured, with blood mist rising and staining the deck. She can only see a black sphere being shot out from the bunkers, which she thought was useless, swaying for a moment before crashing down with a thunderous impact, knocking 2 knights who had just climbed from the cabin to the deck. Sylvie finally understood what the prince meant by "they won't make it through." However, how did his subordinates manage to achieve this? Compared to Lien, who was observing from a distance, Sylvie had a more vivid view of the scene. It was the first time she had witnessed such a sight. No sharp blades or spears were needed. With just round, rolling spheres, people were torn apart. As her vision was too close, she even felt that the blood and entrails of those killed were splashing onto her own body. Several others were struck by the iron spheres, either severing limbs or shattering their skulls. The ship's cabin was now filled with flowing fluids and a mix of red and white. Suddenly, the witch felt a surge of nausea and started puking. Prince Roland noticed her discomfort and handed her a handkerchief, advising her not to use her abilities to watch any further. Sylvie took the handkerchief and wiped her mouth. This was probably the incredible invention that Maisie and Lightning had mentioned, but at that time, no one paid much attention or thought much of it. After all, it was hard to imagine such an astonishing weapon without witnessing it firsthand. She turned her gaze back to the battlefield and saw the Timothy fleet beginning to approach the banks. However, they were unaware that Prince Roland had set up fortifications in more than just one location. But the soldiers inside the bunkers did not give them a chance. The soldiers just aimed their weapons at the targets and easily pulled the trigger. The enemy couldn't hold on for long before collapsing completely. Those who had disembarked from the ships tried to get back on board, while those waiting to disembark scrambled in all directions. The prince put down his binoculars and ordered Axe to take the reserve troops to clear the battlefield. He wanted the leader to be captured. Roland asked Sylvie to follow Axe, as he doesn't want anyone escaping. With a nod, Sylvie agreed to accompany Axe. She suddenly understood why Prince Roland dared to openly protect the witches in this corner of the continent. With such formidable power at his disposal, even Church's divine punishment army would not easily defeat him. Axe arrived with 2 prisoners. Before Roland could even inquire, one of them began shouting loudly, claiming to be a Bart Knight and requesting permission to write a letter to his family. He assured them that his family would undoubtedly offer a generous ransom. The other person introduced himself as a nobleman's second son and expressed willingness to pay a ransom as well. Roland raised an eyebrow in response. He asked if these 2 were the ones who led the attack. Both of them were frightened and hastily pointed out Sir Vincent was the leader, but he had perished during the first wave of the attack. They also requested to have their ropes removed, hoping to receive proper treatment. The prince shook his head and stated that no ransom was necessary. However, if they were willing to reveal Timothy's plan and any information they possessed, he might consider granting them better treatment. The 2 individuals hesitated for a moment but declined the offer, explaining that they had sworn allegiance to Timothy and could not betray their oath. Roland shrugged indifferently and ordered his guards to take them away and hand them over to Axe. Roland turned around and told Axe that he had no restrictions on the methods or means to obtain sufficient intelligence. He made it clear that he would show no mercy towards those who had captured and harmed innocent civilians and dared to invade the Western territory. Roland's tone grew cold. Once you're done questioning them, treat them as deceased. After a few days, Roland returned to the border town. Axe also brought all the information obtained from the interrogation. Roland furrowed his brows. This was just the vanguard force. The information Axe obtained revealed that Timothy dispatched one militia force after another to attack the western borders. He employed the same method to deal with Garcia in Greenwaterport. These forces consisted of criminals, rats, and mostly refugees gathered from various places. The intelligence from the enemy knights revealed that Timothy deceived these people, initially using verbal promises to appease them before having them ingest the first batch of pills. Consequently, they were then under the control of Timothy, as they sought more pills to alleviate their pain and cravings. This attack is merely meant to deplete the border town's resources. The fallen knight Sir Vincent believed that since the town had no walls, he estimated that around 1,000 militiamen who consumed the pills would result in approximately 3,000 casualties. This would be a severe blow to the border town. Meanwhile, he could observe Roland's response and the effectiveness of his tactics. Roland couldn't help but feel a burning hatred and frustration. Timothy was using wave after wave of cannon fodder. Even if Roland managed to emerge victorious without a scratch, it would still be a Pyrrhic victory. Compared to repelling Timothy's invasion, his primary concern was putting an end to this meaningless war. Otherwise, how long would it take for the population to flourish again once Grey Castle was unified? Roland knew that the month of the demons was approaching, and soon the entire western border would be covered in heavy snow, making it impossible for land travel. Timothy undoubtedly intended to act before the winter snow arrived. Roland closed his eyes, pondered for a moment, and continued, expressing his desire to stall this war. Sending envoys or diplomatic communications would be ineffective. Roland was determined to prevent Timothy from seizing the population. He planned to evacuate the people before Timothy could reach them. Additionally, he aimed to instill fear in Timothy regarding the western borders. For instance, allowing some prisoners to escape back to the capital city, spreading fear in the capital city. Despite the risk of exposing their tactics and weapons. However, since there's no way of them obtaining the manufacturing method, Roland wasn't concerned. Lastly, Roland intended to write a warning letter, foretelling the day of the attack in advance, and then launch an assault on the exact day. Roland had decided to attack from the sky. He was no longer the weak and insignificant newcomer who needed to hide himself under disguise. It was time to reveal his true power, step by step, and take Timothy's place on the political stage of Grey Castle. He wanted the kingdom's people to take notice of his presence. It had nothing to do with vanity but rather a form of promotion for his territory and influence. A kingdom filled with corpses and ruins would be of no use to him. Through this demonstration, he hoped to encourage more people to venture to the western borders and stand by his side. As promised, the Margaret Trading Company arrived at the border town. While enjoying a delicious feast, they discussed Garcia's black sail fleet. It was said that after plundering several cities, they sailed north along the coastline, and nobody knew where they had gone. Margaret inquired about the hot air balloon, so Roland led them to the backyard and taught them how to operate it, demonstrating its safety. Once inflated, the balloon remained unaffected by rain, impacts, fire, or even the pecking of birds. Margaret quickly grasped the key points and asked how many gas canisters were needed. Roland replied that it required around 5 or 6 canisters for a single hot air balloon. Margaret thought such alchemical technology would be quite expensive. Roland cleared his throat and employed excellent sales tactics, offering the first inflation of the balloon for free and even including a complimentary camouflage outfit. After the caravan departed, Roland let out a long sigh of relief. The treasury was once again filled, and he could finally begin expanding the population. He looked up at the sky, envisioning the construction of the city next year. The banks of the Crimson Water River would undoubtedly be dotted with residential houses. Roland decided to go and visit Anna in the backyard on the northern slope. Upon entering, the first thing that caught his eye was the floor covered in metal blocks. Roland was astonished to see that they had already reached over 2,000 in number. Anna mentioned that block 1057 was particularly sturdy, while 2284 excelled in both hardness and toughness. Lucia held a small notebook and reported that block 2284 contained 0.8% carbon and 15.2% unknown elements. The tests conducted by Anna and Lucia were of great significance. Roland instructed Lucia to break down the ores into various raw materials, and then Anna would blend them with pure iron in different mass ratios, melt them together, and create test blocks to assess their performance. Although Roland knew that steel was essentially an iron-carbon alloy, with higher carbon content resulting in pig iron and no carbon resulting in pure iron. He was aware that carbon content within a specific range could be classified as steel. Furthermore, even the slightest fluctuation in carbon content could significantly alter the properties of the metal. Therefore, the first thing to be determined was the extent of this range. After a few encouraging words to the two witches, Roland sat back and quietly watched the two girls working. Although the autumn sun still shone brightly, it no longer carried the scorching heat of the summer. He felt a warm sensation throughout his body, accompanied by a long-lost sense of tranquility. He lost track of time as the courtyard gradually grew quiet. Suddenly, he felt a soft hand resting on his forehead. Lucia was nowhere in sight, but Anna stood before him. Roland was startled, and Anna warned him, saying, "Your Highness, be careful not to catch a cold." Anna looked into Roland's eyes and knew that he had something to tell her. Roland hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly shook his head. He held Anna's hand, feeling somewhat perplexed, and roughly explained the plan to expand the population. He mentioned the initial freedom of choice, but now, to save time, he had resorted to some half-enticing, half-coercive methods. Although he did this to prevent the civilians from being forcefully conscripted by Timothy and ultimately succumbing to the ravages of the pills, upon reflection, Roland realized that his actions were not so different from Timothy's. The only distinction lay in their respective goals. Anna covered the prince's mouth, understanding that Roland was concerned that others might not appreciate his actions, and he himself couldn't guarantee that all of his future goals were correct. Roland was unsure whether the means or the desired outcomes were more important. Before he could respond, Anna had already moved closer, holding his hands and whispered softly in his ear, assuring him that she would watch over him carefully. The environment on Slumbering Isle was improving day by day. Once airborne, Tilly could see the bustling crowds and lively markets below. It was no longer the secluded place where only around 300 witches resided in isolation. Through negotiations and agreements, they had established commercial connections with the surrounding islands. Tilly had even brought in a group of ordinary residents from some overcrowded village islands. Although they currently lived on the outskirts of the island, far from the witches, Tilly believed that one day Slumbering Isle would become a city where everyone would live together harmoniously. Tilly could temporarily fly using magic stones, but she hadn't figured out the underlying principles yet. Just as she was conversing with Ashes, a massive white bird descended from the sky. Due to its rapid descent, it crashed onto the ground, raising a cloud of dust. It was Maisie, who couldn't believe that Tilly was actually flying in the sky. Tilly playfully rubbed her cheek and asked Maisie how the witches from Slumbering Isle were doing in the border town. Maisie rummaged through her bag, searching for the letters. They had all entrusted Maisie to deliver them to Tilly, including one from Prince Roland. Ashes took out half of a muffin and offered a piece to Maisie, but she shook her head and instead stuffed a handful of fish jerky into her mouth, mumbling, she went to play with Molly. With that, Maisie flew out of the courtyard, flapping her wings. Ashes felt that Maisie had grown bigger even more in the past month, both in size and maturity. Tilly smiled and said she felt the same, perhaps because life in the border town was truly wonderful. Returning to the room, Tilly tore open the letter sent by Roland and found that apart from a letter filled with content, the remaining dozen or so pages were actually vivid illustrations, laying out the pages of drawings one by one. The contents were somewhat unbelievable and terrifying. The background depicted a desolate wasteland at dusk, with two monstrous creatures engaged in a fierce battle against a group of witches. The witches were clearly at a disadvantage, as their abilities seemed to have lost their effectiveness. Neither snakes nor fireballs could stop the enemy's advance. By the final drawing, several witches lay lifeless in pools of blood. Tilly anxiously grabbed the letter and quickly skimmed through its contents. Soon, she felt her heart tighten as a recurring word in the letter made her hands tremble slightly: demons. The letter described how Hakura obtained an ancient book and led the witches across the Desolation Mountains in search of the Holy Mountain. However, they did not find the Holy Mountain but encountered terrifying monsters instead. These creatures possessed astonishing strength, swift movements, and the ability to command demonic beasts. One of them could even release lightning from its hands. After contemplating for a while and finding no answers, Tilly decided to set aside all of those things and took out Sylvie's letter. She intended to know the results of investigating the Lord of the border town. However, the first sentence of the letter left her stunned, even more so than when she had seen the word demons. Lady Tilly, I have found no traces of disguise or magical influence on Roland Wimbledon. Apart from the Witch Union, there are no other factions of witches hidden in the town. So, I believe, he might be your true brother. Tilly was left speechless, shocked by the revelation in Sylvie's letter. A real brother. How could that be possible? Tilly held the letter in her hands, but her mind couldn't focus. Thoughts swirled in her head like a tidal wave. Among the 5 children of Wimbledon III, the eldest 3 were born close in age and played together. By the time Roland was born, the youngest, Garcia, was already 6 years old, and naturally, they didn't include him in their group. Logically, Tilly should have formed another circle with Roland, but it wasn't the case in reality. Roland longed to be accepted by his 2 older brothers, striving to fit into their circle, but often ended up being the one who was getting bullied. This twisted and volatile treatment caused Roland's character to become distorted and easily angered. Of course, he didn't dare to direct his anger towards the 3 elder siblings, so started bullying Tilly. Ever since Tilly fought back, Roland hadn't provoked her again, and Tilly had chosen to ignore her brother. Even in adulthood, Roland had shown no signs of change. In fact, he had worsened over time. She couldn't believe it. How could someone like him stand with the witches, sheltering them, and even dare to oppose the church? Tilly was perplexed and conflicted. It seemed contradictory to her that someone with Roland's history of bullying and twisted character could now align himself with the very beings he had once despised. The fact that he was willing to go against the church, an institution that held immense power and influence, further intensified her confusion and disbelief. Tilly didn't know what to say for a moment. Ashes nudged her several times before Tilly mentioned that the letter stated that Roland hadn't been controlled or replaced by the witches. When she mentioned the incident with the butt grabbing, Ashes coughed a couple of times. After contemplating for a moment, she remarked that even though they hadn't seen him for just a year, he seemed like a completely different person. Tilly asked Ashes to elaborate further. Ashes thought for a moment and said, "Roland feels clean. Although he doesn't have a preference for extravagant jewelry or clothing like nobles do, his attire is very clean. Overall, Roland now gave a favorable impression." Tilly smiled, surprised that Ashes would speak well of him. She let out a sigh of relief, realizing that her brother had indeed undergone significant changes. But what had prompted his transformation? Perhaps the true reason could only be discovered by meeting him in person. Regaining her focus, Tilly shifted her attention back to the letter. The second half of the letter detailed Sylvie's observations and experiences in the border town, including her daily work and discoveries. As Tilly continued reading, another piece of information caught her attention. It described a weapon capable of launching iron balls and crossbow bolts from iron tubes, with immense power. Although Maisie and Ashes had mentioned such a weapon before, this was the first time Tilly had encountered such a detailed description, complete with hand-drawn illustrations. Ashes suggested that Tilly ask Roland to send a batch of those weapons in her reply. However, Tilly shook her head, explaining that allies should not be approached with suspicion. Such a test would only undermine the trust they had painstakingly built. Besides, they were planning to visit the border town this winter, and it would be better to discuss it in person. Ashes shrugged in response, and Tilly smiled, continuing to read the letter. As her eyes reached the end of the letter, Tilly couldn't help but freeze. Roland had actually invented a type of undergarment designed for women's boing-boings and had gifted it to every adult female member of the Witch Union as a present? It was simply absurd. Wait a minute, Tilly suddenly remembered that when Roland was in the capital, he had also given some noble ladies tight-fitting corsets. Some of them had even been thrown back at his face. This was wildly spread among the nobles. This was definitely something he would do. Tilly felt conflicted. On one hand, it aligned with her memories of him, but on the other hand, she felt that it would be better if he didn't align with those memories. Should she go to the border town to see him this winter or not? Upon returning to the border town, as soon as they entered, Kyle mentioned that he had come up with a feasible plan for large-scale production of sulfuric acid. However, it required a significant amount of lead and skilled craftsmen, and he hoped to seek the assistance of the witches. Roland asked Kyle to provide him with the detailed plan. Then, Roland gestured for him to sit down and taught him another task. Kyle shook his head repeatedly, stating that he didn't have time recently as large-scale acid production was a challenging endeavor that required his full attention. Roland reassured him, saying that it wouldn't require much time. Seeing Kyle's puzzled expression, Roland requested him to manufacture more soap. Kyle immediately recalled the saponification reaction mentioned in elementary chemistry, which involves the reaction between sodium hydroxide and fats or oils to produce alcohol and salt. It was indeed an unusual feeling to hear standard chemical terms from an alchemist's mouth. Roland nodded in agreement, and Kyle still seemed a bit puzzled. It didn't seem important to him, but the prince emphasized that it was crucial. While soap production itself might not be important, the byproduct of the production process was something Roland urgently needed. Kyle immediately realized it was alcohol, and Roland confirmed that he needed alcohol, or glycerin to be exact, as it was a highly important ingredient. Kyle shrugged and said he would assign it to his apprentices, but he would demonstrate the process in front of a few clever apprentices chosen by him. Meanwhile, Roland shared some news with him, mentioning that a sailboat had arrived at the dock with 50 people on board, and one of them claimed to be an alchemist from Crimson Water City. Before Roland could finish his sentence, Kyle stood up excitedly. It was Charles, and he had truly brought his apprentices to join Kyle. Kyle exclaimed joyfully that Charles was his finest disciple, and he will surely fit for the job. Lightning checked her adventuring gear once again, which she carried with her at all times, including survival tools and weapons. Maisie also checked her own belongings, with piles of food laid out in front of Lightning. Lightning was at a loss for words. They were going on an adventure, not having a barbecue in the wilderness, at least bring a weapon. Maisie pointed at her beak, indicating that her beak was her weapon. Lightning sighed. After all, it was just a one-day trip, and they shouldn't encounter any major dangers. They were preparing to explore the westernmost part of the enchanted forest. Lightning had a little secret that she hadn't told anyone. She no longer dared to explore the forest alone. This was a great shame for an adventurer. However, she couldn't deceive herself. The journey to the stone tower had instilled fear in her towards this deep forest. Just the thought of those terrifying creatures potentially hiding somewhere in the forest made her want to escape as quickly as possible. Thunder had once mentioned to her a method to overcome fear, to gradually approach it, observe it, and understand it. Eventually, she would realize that fear wasn't as dreadful as it seemed. This exploration would be Lightning's attempt. With Maisie accompanying her, she felt a bit more confident. They had chosen a safe route, following the Crimson Water River westward without venturing deep into the forest. With this approach, it was unlikely they would encounter any demons. The two quickly approached the magnificent mountain. They had flown to the westernmost part of the forest, where the dark green expanse ended and the land transitioned back to a lighter shade of green. They arrived at a meadow. But as they ventured further, their line of sight was consumed by a pitch-black color that extended all the way to the base of the mountain. They descended towards the dark land. Soon, they realized it was a ground made up of black stones. Maisie pecked at it after landing and found it to be very hard. Lightning picked up a piece of the black stone and examined it closely, realizing that there were countless such stones scattered all around. She collected a few pieces, intending to show them to His Highness upon their return. Lightning called for Maisie, instructing her not to move, and then put on her wind goggles. In an instant, she accelerated to her maximum speed. After flying for about half an hour, she could faintly see the landscape beyond the mountains. She came to a stop and carefully observed what lay ahead. At the edge of her vision, a layer of reddish-brown mist hung over the peaks of the mountains. Roland sat at his desk, pondering how to launch an air raid on the imperial palace of Capital City. Suddenly, he heard a tapping sound from behind the windows. When he turned around, he saw Lightning clinging to the window, looking panicked, while Maisie perched on top of Lightning's head, pecking at the glass. As Nightingale opened the window, the little girl flew into Roland's arms. He gently stroked Lightning's head and comforted her, asking what had happened. Black stones, cool. A huge snowy mountain, cool. Maisie landed on the desk and flapped her wings, delivering the report. With a serious expression, Lightning spoke up, saying she had seen a demon. Roland's face grew solemn, and he told her not to panic, urging her to take her time and calm down. After a while, Lightning raised her head from Prince Roland's arms. She had initially intended to draw the map of the forest, but instead, she discovered a massive mountain covered by a layer of reddish-brown dense fog. The fog was so thick that it resembled undissolved fresh blood, spreading westward without apparent boundaries. The scene was just like the one depicted in Soraya's drawing. After Roland relayed Lightning's findings to everyone, Scroll suggested further investigation of the area covered by the red fog. They needed to ascertain whether it would cross the mountain range and reach the continent along the coastline. Wendy nodded in agreement. They had to be prepared. As the two oldest witches in the Union, Scroll and Wendy were the backbone in the hearts of many witches. Although the others were still somewhat afraid, no one wanted to sit idly by and do nothing. Roland also leaned towards this proposed course of action. Seeing no objections from the group, the plan was essentially settled. The key now was how to implement it. Anna suggested using hot air balloons for reconnaissance. They could camouflage themselves in the sky, using the clouds as cover, and fly over from the sea. Lightning suggested bringing Sylvie along, and Roland nodded, saying he would go as well. As soon as he spoke, Wendy, Scroll, and Nightingale all simultaneously objected, stating that they couldn't let Roland take such risks. Roland, with a serious tone, responded that it wasn't a reckless act. He believed that the demons did not possess the ability to cross the vast sea and high mountains, otherwise, they would have already spread throughout the four kingdoms. They were gathered in the far west, and perhaps they weren't as terrifying as they seemed. There was another reason he didn't mention, one that made him more experienced than anyone in assessing the development of an alien civilization. If he could witness the demons and their cities with his own eyes, it would greatly help in formulating future development directions and counter-strategies. The witches still hesitated. Roland smiled and said that staying in the hot air balloon would definitely be safe. If there was any danger, he wouldn't have let the witches go in the first place. Seeing that their persuasion was ineffective, Nightingale was the first to change her stance. Roland could go, but he had to take Nightingale with him and couldn't leave her side. As he looked into her earnest eyes, Roland knew he couldn't refuse her. After considering it for a while, he announced that the expedition members would be himself, Anna, Wendy, Soraya, Sylvie, Nightingale, Lightning, and Maisie. They would depart in a week. Besides the necessary food, everyone had to carry a pistol, and during this week, everyone must practice diligently. After making the announcement, Roland finally had the time to examine the black mineral Lightning had brought back. He held it in his hand and waited, feeling a slight jump in his heart. In terms of weight, it was much lighter than ordinary stones, making it unlikely to be a metallic ore. It had a hard and lightweight exterior that reflected a metallic luster, and it was exposed on the surface. Could it be coal? Roland asked Anna to release flames, and under the scorching black fire, the stone quickly turned bright red and translucent. Roland immediately realized that it was high-quality anthracite coal. This unexpected discovery filled him with joy. Coal was not rare in Greycastle and was mainly used for kilns and heating. However, its applications were extremely wide-ranging. Before the prevalence of internal combustion engines, the blazing burning of coal fueled everything of steam power. After coking coal, it could replace charcoal for iron and steel smelting, making it much more environmentally friendly than excessive deforestation. Even in the age of electricity, coal could be used to produce coal gas, hydrogen gas, and asphalt, as well as for power generation. It could be considered an excellent and cost-effective fuel. Holding an open-pit coal mine in his hand was very important. The only question was how to develop it effectively. After thinking for a moment, Roland realized that they needed to construct more steamships and fully develop the mining fields in the area. By increasing the number of steamships, they could transport the mine coal more efficiently and expand their capabilities. This would not only meet the local demand for coal but also provide an opportunity for trade and economic growth. The development of the mining fields would require infrastructure, such as railways and processing facilities, to optimize the extraction and utilization of the coal resources. With this unexpected discovery, Roland saw the potential for significant advancements in their industrial development and energy supply. The coal mine would serve as a valuable resource, contributing to the prosperity and progress of their kingdom. In the palace of Greycastle, there was a loud bang as a copper bowl was turned upside down. This was something newly developed by the Alchemist Association of the capital. If used in larger quantities, its power could tear through armor. Timothy was delighted and rewarded the inventor with 25 gold, instructing him to start mass production of it. After the chief alchemist left, a knight remarked that while this invention appeared intimidating, it would be impossible to defeat knights with it. It required ignition to activate, and its effective range was only about half a step. Other knights voiced their agreement, and Timothy felt a twinge of anger. If it weren't for Garcia luring away the alchemist responsible for developing this item at the Alchemist Association, he would have already conquered Greycastle. At that moment, footsteps suddenly echoed outside the door. An anxious guard entered the palace hall and knelt down on one knee. He informed Timothy that the militia force sent by Greycastle to the western border seemed to have suffered heavy losses. The defeated soldiers had returned to the capital, and they had brought with them a letter of inquiry from Roland Wimbledon. Now, many people were aware of the situation and what was written on the letter. The letter stated that Timothy's foolish actions, attacking the western border, were a mistake, and he would pay the price for it. Roland declared that he would launch an attack on the capital in the early second month of autumn, and by then, everyone would witness Timothy's shaky hold on the throne.